I would give about 10 minutes, just an overview of ontologies, and then shift into the community aspect of curating these ontologies, and then finally bringing them to the point where they can help you annotate data in a way that makes it interoperable and federated for querying. So just to start, there are these different scales or levels of controlled vocabulary, starting with dictionaries, good old-fashioned language dictionaries, and moving on to taxonomies that actually start placing each term or entity that you're interested in into a hierarchic structure. Mind maps can accommodate hierarchies, taxonomies. They're kind of a loose association, peer-to-peer association conceptually between concepts. Ghost vocabularies, simple knowledge, I forget what the O stands for, system, is another vocabulary system that adds a little bit more formality to it. There's hierarchy, there's polyhierarchy. Terms can appear under two different parent categories, and it uses a kind of a looser library science conceptual language to allow you to navigate to terms of interest that you can use. And people are using Ghost vocabularies in work these days. AgriVoc is perhaps one you might have heard of. Anyway, I'm going to talk about OWL ontologies, and I'll just get into the details of what they can do or how they represent things. So, and do I get to laser point? Okay, good. So the data dictionaries that computer science folks are familiar with offer up term labels and definitions, but where ontologies start to help out here is by formalizing the labels in a multilingual fashion, definitions, and the other annotations that you can add on that help people, including synonymy, to find the term. And this is all being viewed here in a window provided by a Protégé open source ontology editor. So a lot of the screenshots will be from that. But ontologies go further in offering a URI, or unique identifier, for each term. And that allows you to go onto the web and look up that term no matter where you are and see that same information. And it's disambiguating the semantics of this term, because it's the ID that you trust to associate with the concept, not the label. People use different labels in different databases for the same thing. So that's the first low-hanging gift that the ontology world is offering up to the world. Then, to take a look at the hierarchy of terms, here's an example from an anatomy ontology where a lung is situated as a lateral structure, and it's an anatomical structure, and all the way up to the abstract, most abstract level of an entity in an ontology. So basically, you open any OWL ontology and in Protégé, and you'll find that they all start with this very vague thing called entity. And underneath that, you layer in particular hierarchies with their semantics. So the lung here, one term, is actually situated in multiple places within this Uberon ontology. It's actually an endoderm-derived structure. That means skin's involved. It's a organ meat, according to the ontologists or the biologists. It's a respiration organ, so now we're talking about what its role is with respect to physiology. And it's a thoracic cavity element, so it's talking about where that thing is. So ontologies are giving you this polyhierarchy ability to find a term and see its different uses and senses. So the global identifiers are a safe bet, and that's the low-hanging fruit. Up here with the hierarchies, this allows us data mapping and sharing. If your term in one ontology or vocabulary is more detailed than another, then you can kind of know how to map your content to that and vice versa. Okay. So then next up, qualitative and quantitative relations. So we just saw this whole hierarchy. Ontologists call it an ISA, one thing being a subclass of another is a relationship, the primary one that you'll open up a protege and see an ontology content organized by. But there are these other relations like located in, next to, derives from, and those are all showing up in a language of relationships, and I'll touch on that in a bit. So the qualitative and quantitative relations are themselves named things that are a library that you can choose from to organize and relate terms with. And at the very top, once you've got these structures of vocabulary, just like a grammar book with its verbs and nouns and adjectives, then you can launch sentences using a querying language, into the ontology, or with the ontology, into a database that's been encoded in that ontology. And that's the querying and reasoning height of the pyramid. However, it's still a process of creating these ontologies. And so if you go to an ontology resource to try to use it, you may find that it's missing terms. And that's where ComFocus is at a bit. It needs to develop new terms in order to help you guys describe your behavioral science work. All right, so I mentioned the OBO Foundry, Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology Foundry, as being a collection of ontologies that are all trying to operate under one set of curational standards that's set, it's also evolving itself. So this, some aspects of ontology are a little bit Jello-like, and that's frustrating for people coming and trying to figure out which relationships to use and so on. But in it, you will, if you go to this OBO Foundry site, you'll get a list of over 50 active ontologies, all with curation teams working on specific domains such as CHEBI, chemicals for entities of biological interest. There are over 50,000 or 60,000 chemicals in there. Vitamins, nutrients, pertinent to the food world. DOID, human disease ontology, big vocabulary of diseases. Gene ontology is kind of the ancestor that started them all off as a success story, coping with the inundation of genomic discoveries in the last 20 years. And then we've got ontologies like BFO, which are at the very top, basic formal ontology, and they're trying to organize the world into kinds of things, just like grammar does. Anything you can point at is a material entity. The processes that transform material entities from one thing to another are a kind of entity in the ontology, and so are characteristics of things. So BFO actually has, or the community has a special ontology called the relationship ontology, which is where we put all our relationships that might connect the characteristics to the things they're about, to the kinds of material entity and the kinds of process. So other ontologies like OBI, Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, focus on particular domains. OBI's big thing is assays. Assays are like doing MRI scans or actually surveys. Survey is an assay, some kind of process to look at something in the environment or a person and then collect information. Okay, so OBO Foundry has these curational principles, and these happen to line up nicely, even though they were done, many of them before, like 15, 20 years ago. They line up very nicely with the aims of FAIR data and open science. So they have standards around how to create textual definitions, how to reuse relationships, how to take responsibility for an ontology and upkeep it. So, just to give you some examples of quality control issues in ontologies, and as well, the issue of developing an ontology, say on your own, and then wanting to promote it into the Obo Foundry, and then running into some problems as your ontology is exposed within an environment of hundreds or even thousands of other ontologies. So one question to pose to yourself is, if you're making an ontology or if you're looking at somebody else's ontology, if I go searching for a term in an ontology lookup service that is covering lots of ontologies, what am I going to get back? Will it be easy for me to see which ontology term I should be using to tag my data set with, like bag of terms, or to describe it so the rest of the world can find it? So there are issues right now. Here's an example of searching for patient, and here are at least 12 or 10 different ontologies that are all defining patient. And this is no fun in the age of data interoperability, because we only want to go find one term. And maybe there is just one term one ontology that's done a really good job of defining this. But if there are different senses at work of patient, like I'm a very patient person, or I'm a medical patient, then the label should indicate that right off the bat, so that a user can make a decision about which term they want to use. So that's the first point. Does the label clearly indicate a thing is process equality? So in our use of vocabulary, we do know what process words sound like. In English, they often have ing, thinking, running, walking. That's an easy giveaway, but other kinds of labels may not indicate that so clearly. So you might want to be more explicit and longer with your ontology name. Okay. Then question comes up, is the ontology label important when reusing in an application? Ontology labels are often longer than what you want to see on a form or in an application. So it's very important to think when you're developing a system to use them to actually enable the interface to use shorter names, depending on the context. So don't expect ontologies to be nice and short and concise with their labels. And the last thing to note is, what if an ontology term is replaced by another or moved to another ontology? Here we have all these different ontologies with their use of patient. And maybe some of them realize they should actually be reusing one ontology and helping us all out so we don't have to keep on converting data between databases. What do you do when you want to switch to using somebody else's term? You deprecate this term, but you keep it in your database, your ontology going forward, and you give a little replaced by annotation so that anybody who wants to update their database can just ideally press a button, look up all this replaced by information, and refresh your database with the new terms in place. So this is separating this notion that you have to be dependent on the codes offered in your ontology, creating a flexible system where you can keep up with the fact that these ontologies haven't settled down to a single Esperanto of data science. We're still looking at many different variants. And so this can be a painful process at time, doing curation. Okay, I have 15 minutes left. I'm going to zip ahead. So there are various ontology lookup services that you can use. A great exercise to see where, say, this mainly Obo Foundry focused ontology setup is to go to the portal and type in words that are pertinent to your area of interest, your expertise, and see if you get hits. Here's questionnaire being returned that shows the hierarchy and details is according to one ontology. The biggest ontology portal right now is bioportal, so chances are you will find some term there, more likely than in some of the others. But I'm going to just give you a quick view of what a couple of these ontologies offer up. So the human disease ontology has, in the food area, a whole bunch of gastrointestinal allergies, most of them food allergies, and it's created precomposed terms to handle allergy times a particular food. So they've got the hierarchy of these allergies, and then they also are reusing this has allergic trigger relationship to connect, say, celery food product to a celery allergy. That's the sort of basic level. So they're actually adding a little bit of data information into the ontology. Foodon, which I lead curation of, along with a whole other team of people, has these different facets in it. And the way it works at a very simple level, you can use right away, is if you have a food product like organic mashed carrot baby food, jarred, then you can start using terms from the different facets of the ontology to describe the plant anatomy part, where the food comes from, the taxonomy of the plant, where it originated, say in agriculture, the processes that have been applied to it in food processing, any claims that might be made, labeling claims, the actual characteristic of the material. So, and then just to say, some of you might be familiar with Langwell and the whole food composition world. This vocabulary was mainly based on Langwell. So quick crash course in some other aspects of ontology. So if you are looking at this at the most general level, there are two kinds of relationships: object properties and data properties. Object properties allow relationships between kinds of entity that you've created, and then data properties actually get you down into the details of measurable things like age and dates and times associated with your objects. And this is all the language with which to create sentences and have terms in more specific ontologies. So player, member of team, player has name, and then some string. And so you've got the language, and now you can start spitting out a bunch of sentences with it. This is all in the graph kind of world of ontology that we test our language out in, but it can be converted into columns of spreadsheets that are about players and next door the team they're related to. So these days, a kind of a simple way of coding this is to add an ontology ID to a column or to a pick list value to know how to convert it against other people's data if they've done the same thing. Okay, one last techie kind of thing. A lot of times when you're perusing ontologies, you'll see material entity, you'll see either full models, very detailed models, such as this process-oriented one, materials, and a process being applied to a material, outputting some other material, or a process being applied to a material and outputting information. These materials have characteristics that might change along the way. You get one view that a lot of people just do, and they skip the processes. They condense this into basically a set of relationships between material things or information directly. So the is about is skipping this whole description of how that information was collected, similarly with the material processing. Or you'll get a process-only model. You just really abstract what you're talking about to one process leading to another, or having other processes as parts. All right, just touching on one or two other ontologies, and then I'll zip ahead. So compositional dietary nutrition ontology, starting to be used by USDA, or at least mapped over to. It's our offering in terms of actually naming in a nutritionist-friendly way the over 500 vitamins, minerals that are pertinent to food. And so there's a hierarchy there that's maintained by one team led in Australia. And there's a reference there. Ontology for Nutritional Studies, a project that wrapped up a couple of years ago and is now undergoing a new revamp next week or 2 weeks from now. And it's covering the kinds of diet that people have and their patterns. And the point to make there is it's important to create a community, a broader community, to help finesse your ontology over time. Don't rely on funding from a project, one particular project. Start to shift to agency, interest, and support more broadly. More about that in a moment. So this just summarizes the fact that ontologies, curators are sitting over here. They're basically contributing to the standardization effort by making sure that each term is clearly defined and used in a standard. And then data curators are using those standards to curate their data, and finally that enables the data federation that you can then query. You have to choose your ontologies, though, for this work. So finally, moving back to ComFocus domain, what is of interest to the ComFocus folks? Behavioral modeling and naming of mental processes that might be related to that behavior. The big one is the behavior change intervention ontology. There's an address for it. And it sidesteps the challenge of modeling mysterious mental concepts in favor of looking at kinds of interventions that are placed onto people and how they react, and then measuring response. So there's a great paper by Jana Hastings, one of the authors of the BCIO, that also talks about how to compose an ontology, talks about the way to craft definitions, and she's one of the authors of the BCIO, so it's a great read. There are various other behavior-related efforts, mental health and so on. So this BSSO Foundry is their own foundry, a lot compatible with OBO Foundry principles, but focused on behavioral sciences. Good to check that out. Okay, so I didn't know much about ComFocus 3 months ago, and actually this week has been mainly a crash course for me in what you guys are doing. So yesterday I composed a process-oriented, from what I could tell, model of what you guys are up to. So I'm just going to talk you through that. Hopefully the language I've talked about so far helps in this regard, and I've got a few minutes. So over here we've got food production. This is food-on territory, or agronomy ontology territory, to describe how things are made in the field or in the food system. There may be some food processing that you're interested in, ultra-processed foods or whatever, so you get vocabulary around that. You finally end up with this food product with its various characteristic qualities: color, mass, edibility, flavor. You might have label claims, best if used by date, nutritional claims on the labeling, kinds of food packaging. So that's of interest. Maybe it's part of a basket of other foods. So you need ways of describing all of that. If you're over here trying to choose survey questions from thousands and thousands of surveys, and you're trying to create standards around that and trying to identify which questions are pertinent to your study. So you need kind of a semantic understanding of how to categorize these survey questions with respect to all the other areas of interest. And that actually would show up either at the experimental design level, where you're just looking at a subset of people and products and so on, or it's showing up in the variables that you're testing in your actual experiment. So in between the assay or the measures that you guys are standardizing, they're all paying attention to the person, I think, mainly. And this person is engaged in all of these mysterious mental processes, but there are actually ontologies out there describing a lot of those terms. So perception, tasting, smelling, seeing, these are all processes the person is engaged in. They also may have dispositions, attitudes, or beliefs that are changing or not. And they may exhibit measurable human behavior and making decisions about that, obtaining something, eating it, drinking it, attending consciousness to different things. So obviously some of your measures are semantically related to all of these different things. Eye tracking is as far as I can tell, is a way of measuring attending. Yeah, so that's kind of a process-oriented framework for looking at the semantics of things. But how? That's just like a top-level kind of first pass. But it's going to be involving all of these different ontologies. So there needs to be an awareness of what's out there. This is just a snapshot of all of the ontologies that have grown up around food in Obo Foundry, and there are others out there in the world, but covering nutrition, how to describe a nutritional study, the diseases, and food and drug interactions, and so on. So that's a sample from my world. And now we come to what it takes to describe and understand these as a user and as a professional. So as an example, Foodon started a monthly call where we were talking, this is a couple of years ago, about diet terms that were submitted to Foodon. And we discussed them with a group of other people from different agencies around the world for 4 months, and we eventually came up with 100 different diet and dietary patterns, and we put them into the ontology for nutritional studies because that seemed to be the best domain place to put them. So I'm advocating the same thing for ComFocus later in the future after the first iteration to flesh out and come to semantic agreement on the use of all the terms about behavior and so on within the group, wider group. We also have a weekly call on either the food curation or the food processing model, since there are a lot of missing pieces still. And backing it up with videos that people can go back to. So lastly, there's this continuum, as you kind of get a taste for, all the way from agriculture to consumer. There are all of these little more domain-specific ontologies sitting along that. And it may be that your studies are tapping into the domains that touch on any number of these things. So those are the ontologies, but who's actually helping out in this regard? So curation community, institutional support. We start to see single agencies leading the curation of these different ontologies. Plant ontology, Uberon anatomy, several different agencies helping there. Foodon ontology curation team, we've got help, I'll show on the next slide. INRAE has got this process and observation ontology going, and so on. For us in Foodon, we're relying heavily on the nutrition ontology, on ChemP, on the plant ontology, and animal taxonomy, environment, agronomy. So there are these agencies that are involved in each of those things, and they are using them in biosamples related to sequencing, in mass spectrometry of food nutritional contents in foods, and so on. All these emerging databases, USDA. So that's how I wanted to finish off, and I hope that helps paint the scene for what's happening in the ontology world.